Officer Patrick Wallace arrests a black man named Brandon Morgan riding a sleek motorbike, convinced he's just caught a thief in action. But 10 minutes later, a shocking twist shatters his assumptions, and karma strikes hard. What happens when the line between law enforcement and personal bias gets crossed? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Officer Patrick Wallace cruised through the peaceful suburban streets in his patrol car. The fading light cast long shadows across neatly manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. Patrick's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He let out a deep sigh, feeling the weight of his years on the force. Pride swelled in his chest as he thought about all the good he'd done, but a nagging tiredness tugged at the corners of his mind. Retirement was just around the corner, and part of him couldn't wait to hang up his badge for good. As he turned onto Maple Street, the glare of headlights caught his attention. A sleek, expensive, powerful motorcycle roared past, its rider clad in casual clothes. Patrick's eyes narrowed as he caught a glimpse of the man's face, young, black, and carefree. Something didn't sit right with Patrick. His gut twisted with suspicion. How could a kid like that afford such an expensive bike? He muttered to himself, his voice gruff with disapproval. Without thinking, Patrick flipped on his lights and sirens. The motorcycle slowed and pulled over to the curb. As Patrick stepped out of his cruiser, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Years of dealing with certain types of crime had left their mark on him, coloring his perception in ways he didn't even realize. The rider, Brandon Morgan, switched off his bike and removed his helmet. He looked confused but remained calm as Patrick approached. "License and registration, please," Patrick demanded, his tone curt and authoritative. Brandon's brow furrowed. "Of course, officer. May I ask what seems to be the problem?" Patrick's jaw clenched. The young man's polite demeanor only made him more suspicious. "Just routine, sir." "Where did you get this motorcycle?" As Brandon reached for his wallet, Patrick's hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster. The action didn't go unnoticed by Brandon, whose eyes widened slightly. "I bought it, officer," Brandon replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "I saved up for years to afford it." Patrick's eyes narrowed as he examined Brandon's license. Everything seemed to be in order, but he couldn't shake his gut feeling. "Step off the bike, please. I'm going to need to run the plates." Brandon hesitated for a moment, a flicker of frustration crossing his face before he complied. As he stood beside his prized motorcycle, Brandon felt a mix of anger and disappointment. He'd faced situations like this before, but it never got easier. Patrick radioed in the plate number, his suspicion growing with each passing second. He was so caught up in his assumptions that he failed to notice the pain in Brandon's eyes, or the way the young man's shoulders sagged under the weight of yet another unfair judgment. Officer Patrick stood a few paces away from Brandon, his eyes narrowed and watchful. The streetlights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Patrick's mind raced, piecing together what he believed to be evidence of wrongdoing. He took in Brandon's appearance, worn jeans, a simple t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers. How could someone dressed like that own such an expensive bike? Patrick thought, his suspicion growing with each passing moment. Brandon shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his posture relaxed despite the tense situation. He ran a hand through his short hair, then stuffed both hands in his pockets. To Patrick, this casual demeanor screamed guilt. "Sir, where are you coming from?" Patrick asked, his voice gruff and demanding. Brandon raised an eyebrow. "I was just out for a ride, officer. Is there a problem?" Patrick's jaw clenched. The young man's laid-back attitude only fueled his suspicions. "And where exactly were you riding?" "Just around the neighborhood," Brandon replied with a shrug. "It's a nice afternoon for a ride." Patrick's eyes darted between Brandon and the gleaming motorcycle. The contrast between the two seemed too stark to ignore. In his mind, the pieces were falling into place. This had to be a stolen bike. "You seem awfully calm for someone who's been pulled over," Patrick remarked, his tone accusatory. Brandon took a deep breath before responding. "I'm just trying to cooperate, sir. I haven't done anything wrong." But Patrick wasn't convinced. He circled the motorcycle, running his hand along its smooth surface. The bike was immaculate, clearly well cared for. It only made Brandon's casual appearance stand out more. "This is a very expensive piece of machinery," Patrick said, his voice laced with doubt. "How long did you say you've owned it?" Brandon's brow furrowed slightly. "I didn't say, but I've had it for about a year now. I saved up for a long time to buy it." Patrick scoffed inwardly. The story seemed too convenient, too rehearsed. He'd heard similar tales from countless suspects over the years. In his mind, Brandon's calm demeanor was just a facade, hiding the nervousness of a guilty man. As he waited for the response from dispatch about the plates, Patrick couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something big. He was certain that this young man, with his casual clothes and relaxed attitude, couldn't possibly be the rightful owner of such a high-end motorcycle. The pieces all fit together in his mind, forming a picture of guilt that he couldn't ignore. Officer Patrick's face hardened as he approached Brandon. His steps were quick and purposeful, his hand resting on his belt. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "License and registration now," Patrick barked, his voice sharp and demanding. Brandon's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he kept his composure. "Of course, officer," he said calmly, reaching for his wallet. "May I ask what this is about?" Patrick ignored the question, his eyes fixed on Brandon's every move. "Just hand over the documents," he snapped. With steady hands, Brandon pulled out his license and reached into his jacket for the bike's registration. He held them out to Patrick, his voice level. "Here you go, sir. Everything should be in order." Patrick snatched the papers, barely glancing at them before fixing Brandon with a hard stare. "You expect me to believe this bike is yours?" he scoffed, gesturing to the gleaming motorcycle. Brandon took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "Yes, sir. I purchased it last year. I worked hard and saved up for it." But Patrick wasn't listening. His mind was made up, convinced that Brandon was lying. He shook his head, a look of disgust on his face. "A likely story. You expect me to believe someone like you could afford this?" Brandon's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand your concern, officer, but I assure you this bike is mine. I'm a professional with a good job. I saved for years to buy it." Patrick's face flushed red with anger. He stepped closer to Brandon, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me, boy. I've been on this job longer than you've been alive. I know a stolen bike when I see one." The air crackled with tension as Patrick's accusation hung between them. Brandon's calm facade began to crack, his eyes flashing with a mix of hurt and anger. But he fought to maintain his composure, knowing that losing his cool would only make things worse. "Sir, I'm not lying," Brandon insisted, his voice strained but still controlled. "If you check the registration, you'll see everything is in order. I have nothing to hide." But Patrick was beyond reason now, his suspicion having boiled over into certainty. He paced around the bike, his movements agitated and aggressive. "I don't care what those papers say. There's no way this bike is yours. You're coming with me to the station until we sort this out." The situation had escalated far beyond a routine traffic stop. Brandon stood there, caught between disbelief and growing anger, as Officer Patrick's unfounded suspicions threatened to spiral out of control. Officer Patrick's face twisted with determination as he reached for his handcuffs. "That's it. You're under arrest," he growled, his voice dripping with misplaced authority. Brandon's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Officer, please, you're making a huge mistake," he pleaded, his calm demeanor finally cracking under the weight of the injustice. But Patrick wasn't listening. His mind was made up, blinded by his own assumptions. He roughly grabbed Brandon's wrists, snapping the cold metal cuffs around them. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, reciting the Miranda rights with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of years on the job. As the scene unfolded, the world around them seemed to slow down. Passing cars began to slow, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. A few pedestrians stopped in their tracks, watching with wide eyes as Brandon was being arrested for no apparent reason. "Please, sir," Brandon tried one last time, his voice strained but still controlled. "Just look at my ID. I'm a CIA agent. This is all a misunderstanding." Patrick scoffed, his grip on Brandon's arm tightening. Yeah, right. And I'm the Tooth Fairy. Save your stories for the station. The commotion started to draw more attention. A small crowd began to form on the sidewalk, murmurs of confusion and concern rippling through the onlookers. Brandon could feel their eyes on him, a mix of pity and shock on their faces. Suddenly, the distinctive sound of phone cameras clicking filled the air. Several bystanders had pulled out their phones, recording the arrest. The soft glow of screens illuminated concerned faces in the fading evening light. "What's he being arrested for?" someone in the crowd called out. "He didn't do anything wrong," another voice chimed in. Patrick's face reddened, a bead of sweat forming on his brow as he realized the situation was spiraling out of his control. But instead of reconsidering his actions, he doubled down. "Move along, folks. This is police business," he barked at the crowd, trying to assert his authority. But the crowd didn't budge. If anything, it grew larger, people drawn to the unfolding drama like moths to a flame. The air was thick with tension, a powder keg ready to explode. Brandon stood tall despite the handcuffs, his dignity intact, even as he was being wrongfully arrested. He looked at the crowd, then back at Officer Patrick. "You're making a mistake that you'll regret," he said softly, his words carrying a weight that Patrick chose to ignore. With a rough shove, Patrick began leading Brandon towards his squad car. The crowd parted reluctantly, their phones still raised, capturing every moment of the unjust arrest. Brandon's expensive motorbike stood abandoned in the parking lot, a silent witness to the unfolding travesty. As they neared the police car, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. People were shaking their heads in disbelief, some even shouting at Officer Patrick to stop. But Patrick pressed on, his jaw set in grim determination, seemingly oblivious to the storm he was brewing. As Officer Patrick led Brandon towards the squad car, something unexpected happened. Despite being handcuffed, Brandon managed to slip his hand into his pocket and pull out his cell phone. With surprising dexterity, he unlocked the device and began dialing a number. Officer Patrick noticed the movement and scoffed. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice laced with annoyance. "You can make your one phone call at the station." But Brandon didn't respond. He simply held the phone to his ear, his face a mask of calm determination. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the handcuffed man made his call right there on the street. "He's bluffing," Patrick muttered to himself, trying to quash the tiny seed of doubt that had begun to sprout in his mind. He reached for the phone, but Brandon smoothly turned away, keeping it just out of reach. "Hello," Brandon said into the phone, his voice steady and clear. "This is Agent Morgan. I need you to contact Director Simmons immediately. Tell her it's an emergency." Patrick rolled his eyes, convinced it was all an act. "All right, that's enough," he growled, making another grab for the phone. But something in Brandon's demeanor made him hesitate. Brandon continued speaking, his tone professional and composed. "Yes, I'm currently being arrested by a local officer. No, there are no charges. It appears to be a misunderstanding based on certain assumptions." The crowd had gone eerily quiet, hanging on every word. Even the constant clicking of phone cameras had subsided as people strained to hear the conversation. Officer Patrick felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. The seed of doubt was growing, despite his best efforts to ignore it. What if this man was telling the truth? What if he really was a CIA agent? But pride and stubbornness won out. "Enough with the theatrics," Patrick snapped, finally snatching the phone away. He ended the call and shoved the device into his pocket. "You can explain all this at the station." Brandon didn't argue or plead. He simply nodded, a look of quiet resignation on his face. "As you wish, officer," he said softly. "But I want you to remember this moment. Remember that I tried to resolve this peacefully." Patrick felt a chill run down his spine at Brandon's words. The man's calmness was unnerving. Most people he arrested would be shouting, pleading, or threatening by now. But not Brandon. He stood tall, dignified even in handcuffs, as if he knew something Patrick didn't. As they reached the squad car, Patrick opened the back door. But before he could usher Brandon inside, a commotion erupted from the crowd. People were pointing down the street, their faces a mix of surprise and anticipation. Patrick turned to look, his hand still on Brandon's arm. In the distance, he could see flashing lights approaching rapidly. But they weren't the familiar blue and red of police vehicles. These lights were different, sleek black SUVs with government plates barreling towards them at high speed. As if on cue, the black SUVs screeched to a halt, surrounding Officer Patrick's squad car. Men and women in dark suits poured out, their faces stern and focused. Brandon stood calmly by the car, still in handcuffs as the agents approached. Officer Patrick's heart raced. He felt like he was in a movie, but this was all too real. Just as he was about to speak, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the chief. With shaking hands, he answered. "Wallace," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What in God's name have you done?" The chief's voice boomed through the speaker. Patrick winced, holding the phone away from his ear. "Sir, Shut it, Wallace! Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" Patrick's mouth went dry. He looked at Brandon, who was now being released from the handcuffs by one of the agents. I thought... "You thought wrong," the chief roared. "That man is a high-ranking CIA agent, you idiot." Patrick felt the blood drain from his face. His legs went weak, and he had to lean against his car to stay upright. The crowd around them had grown, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. "Release him immediately," the chief demanded. "Then get your sorry behind back to the station for a debriefing. And Wallace, pray this doesn't end your career." The line went dead. Patrick stared at his phone in disbelief, his mind reeling from the chief's words. He looked up to see Brandon, now free from the cuffs, speaking quietly with the other agents. Swallowing hard, Patrick approached Brandon. I'm so sorry," he stammered. "There's been a terrible mistake." Brandon turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, there has," he said simply. Patrick felt shame wash over him. He'd let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences. "I should have listened to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Brandon nodded, then turned back to the other agents. Patrick stood there, feeling exposed and foolish in front of the crowd and the CIA agents. He knew he had a long, difficult road ahead of him. This mistake could cost him everything he'd worked for over his long career. As Patrick turned to head back to his squad car, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. The face that looked back at him was one he barely recognized, a man who had let prejudice guide his actions with disastrous results. He knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Officer Patrick stood frozen, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the handcuffs. The cold metal clicked open, and Brandon calmly stepped away, rubbing his wrists. The contrast between them was stark, Brandon's composed demeanor only highlighting Patrick's crumbling facade. I'm so sorry," Patrick mumbled, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the growing crowd. Brandon didn't respond immediately. He walked over to his motorcycle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Patrick watched, feeling smaller with each passing second. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, threatening to crush him where he stood. As Brandon swung his leg over the bike, he finally turned to face Patrick. His eyes were steady, his voice low but clear. "This isn't over, Officer Wallace," he said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken consequences. With a quick twist of the key, the motorcycle roared to life. Brandon revved the engine once, then smoothly pulled away from the curb. Patrick watched him disappear down the street, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Left alone in the aftermath, Patrick became acutely aware of the crowd surrounding him. Dozens of eyes bore into him, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. Smartphones were still raised, their lenses capturing every moment of his humiliation. Patrick's cheeks burned with shame. He could hear snippets of conversation from the onlookers. "Did you see that? I can't believe he just arrested him like that. What was he thinking?" Each whispered comment felt like a physical blow. Patrick's shoulders slumped as he turned back to his squad car. The vehicle that had always been a source of pride now felt like a cage, trapping him with his own mistakes. As he reached for the door handle, Patrick caught sight of his reflection in the window. The face staring back at him was a stranger, pale, shaken, and stripped of the confidence he'd worn like armor for so many years. In that moment, the full weight of what had just happened crashed down upon him. Officer Patrick drove back to the station in a daze, his mind replaying the disastrous encounter over and over. The squad car, once his sanctuary, now felt suffocating. As he pulled into the parking lot, he could see his colleagues watching him through the windows. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and disappointment. With heavy steps, Patrick made his way inside. The usual chatter of the bullpen died down as he entered, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. He could feel the weight of their stares on his back as he walked towards the chief's office. Before he could even knock, the chief's voice boomed from inside. "Wallace, get in here now." Patrick's hand trembled as he turned the doorknob. Inside, he found not just the chief, but also the deputy chief and the head of internal affairs. Their stern faces made his stomach churn. "Sit down, Wallace," the chief ordered, his voice cold and sharp. Patrick lowered himself into the chair, feeling smaller than he ever had in his entire career. The chief leaned forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've not only embarrassed this department, but you've also opened us up to a potential lawsuit." Patrick opened his mouth to speak, but the chief cut him off. "No, don't say anything. I don't want to hear your excuses. What you did out there was textbook racial profiling. You arrested a man based on nothing but your own prejudiced assumptions." The words hit Patrick like a physical blow. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, but now he was forced to confront an ugly truth about himself. The deputy chief chimed in, her voice laced with disappointment. "Officer Wallace, your actions today go against everything we stand for as law enforcement officers. We're here to protect and serve all members of our community, not to harass them based on the color of their skin." Patrick felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to maintain his composure. The head of internal affairs spoke next, his tone businesslike. "We'll be conducting a full investigation into this incident. You'll need to file a detailed report of everything that happened, and I mean everything. No sugarcoating, no omissions." The chief nodded grimly. "You're suspended without pay pending the results of the investigation. Turn in your badge and gun before you leave today." Patrick's world seemed to crumble around him. Everything he'd worked for, his entire identity as a police officer, was being stripped away. And the worst part was, he knew he deserved it. As he left the office, the reality of his actions began to sink in. He'd let his biases cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he'd betrayed his oath to serve and protect. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. Officer Patrick sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he stared at the blank screen. The bullpen around him buzzed with activity, but he felt isolated, as if in a bubble of shame. With a deep breath, he began to type. Each word felt like a confession, laying bare his biases and mistakes. He described how he'd spotted Brandon on the motorcycle, the assumptions he'd made, and the baseless arrest that followed. As he typed, the reality of his actions sank in deeper. Colleagues walked past his desk, their eyes averting when he looked up. The whispers and sidelong glances made it clear that word had spread quickly. Officer Patrick's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but he forced himself to continue writing. As he detailed Brandon's calm demeanor and his own aggressive approach, Patrick felt a wave of guilt wash over him. How could he have been so wrong? How had he let his prejudices cloud his judgment so completely? With trembling hands, he finished the report and hit print. The sound of the printer seemed louder than usual in the uncomfortable silence that had settled around him. He gathered the papers, double-checked them, and stood up. The walk to the chief's office felt like the longest of his life. Every step echoed in his ears as he approached the door. He knocked softly. "Come in," the chief's gruff voice called out. Officer Patrick entered, his head bowed. He handed over the report without a word. The chief glanced through it, his frown deepening with each page. Finally, the chief looked up. "Wallace, I hope you understand the gravity of your actions." He pulled out a form from his desk drawer. "This is your suspension notice. 1 month, without pay." Patrick nodded, unable to meet the chief's eyes. He took the notice with numb fingers. "I suggest you use this time to reflect on your choices and biases," the chief added, his tone softening slightly. "We all make mistakes, Wallace, but it's what we do after that defines us." Officer Patrick left the office, clutching the suspension notice. As he walked through the station, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues following him. Some looked sympathetic, others disappointed, but most just looked away. He gathered his personal belongings, each item a reminder of the career he'd jeopardized. As he headed towards the exit, the weight of his actions and the uncertainty of his future pressed down on him. Officer Patrick stepped out into the afternoon sun, feeling more lost and humiliated than he ever had in his life. As Officer Patrick grappled with his suspension, Brandon Morgan was taking action. From his office at the CIA, he crafted a powerful statement about the incident. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his calm exterior masking the deep emotions within. "Yesterday, I was wrongfully arrested while riding my motorcycle," Brandon's statement began. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a clear case of racial profiling, a symptom of the systemic issues plaguing our law enforcement. Brandon chose his words carefully, focusing on the broader problem rather than his personal experience. He didn't name Officer Patrick, instead using the incident as a springboard to discuss deeper, more pervasive issues. "This event highlights the unconscious biases that too many officers carry," he continued. "These biases lead to unjust actions, eroding trust between law enforcement and the communities they're meant to serve." As Brandon hit send, he knew his words would spark a conversation, but even he couldn't have predicted how quickly it would spread. Within hours, the statement went viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with reactions, and hashtags demanding justice and reform trended nationwide. Brandon's measured tone and clear articulation of the problems resonated with people from all walks of life. Protests sprang up in cities across the country. People marched with signs quoting Brandon's words, calling for accountability and change in law enforcement practices. Meanwhile, Officer Patrick sat in his living room, eyes glued to the TV. He watched in disbelief as his mistake became the focus of a national conversation. News anchors dissected the incident, experts weighed in on systemic racism, and footage of the protests filled the screen. In breaking news, protests continue nationwide following a CIA agent's statement about his wrongful arrest, the anchor announced. The incident has reignited debates about racial profiling in law enforcement. Patrick's stomach churned as he realized the full impact of his actions. What he had dismissed as a routine stop had now become a symbol of everything wrong with the system he'd served for decades. The pressure on the police department mounted, calls flooded in demanding action, reform, and accountability. Patrick's mistake had become a catalyst for a movement much larger than himself. As he watched the crowds on TV chanting for justice, Officer Patrick felt the weight of his actions more heavily than ever before. His personal lapse in judgment had exposed deep-rooted issues, and now the whole world was watching. That night, Officer Patrick slumped on his living room couch, the weight of recent events pressing down on him. The house felt eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside. As he stared blankly at the TV, the sound of a key turning in the front door broke the silence. His son, Jake, walked in, his face a mix of emotions. The young man stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on his father. "Dad, we need to talk," Jake said, his voice trembling slightly. Officer Patrick nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. Jake sat down across from him, his posture tense. "I saw the news," Jake began. "How could you do that, Dad? How could you arrest someone just because of how they looked?" Patrick felt a lump form in his throat. "Jake, it's not that simple. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Jake interrupted, his voice rising. "I'm studying criminal justice to make a difference, to be better than this. And now I find out my own father is part of the problem." The words hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. He saw the disappointment in his son's eyes, the shame etched across his face. "Son, I made a mistake, I know that now," Patrick said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "A mistake? Dad, This goes beyond a simple mistake. You've reinforced every negative stereotype about cops. Do you have any idea how this makes me feel?" Patrick reached out to touch his son's arm, but Jake pulled away. The rejection stung, deepening the pit in Patrick's stomach. "I'm sorry, Jake, I truly am," Patrick said, his eyes welling up with tears. "Sorry isn't enough, Dad," Jake replied, his voice cold. "I always looked up to you, always wanted to follow in your footsteps. But now, I don't even know who you are anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Patrick felt the divide between him and his son growing wider with each passing second. He wanted to explain, to make Jake understand the pressures of the job, the split-second decisions, but he knew any excuse would only make things worse. Jake stood up, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I need some time to process this, Dad. I can't be here right now." As Jake walked out of the room, Patrick called after him, "Jake, please!" But the sound of the front door slamming shut was his only response. Patrick sat there, alone in the quiet house, feeling more isolated than ever before. The consequences of his actions had reached beyond his career, beyond the public outcry. They had now struck at the very heart of his family. The next morning, Officer Patrick sat at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making even the simplest tasks feel impossible. He knew he had to do something, anything, to make things right. With trembling fingers, he picked up his phone and dialed Brandon's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello?" Brandon's voice was cool and distant. Patrick took a deep breath. "Mr. Morgan, this is Officer Wallace. I was hoping we could meet. I'd like to apologize in person for what happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Patrick could almost feel Brandon's anger and suspicion through the phone. "Officer Wallace," Brandon finally replied, his tone clipped. "I'm not interested in empty words or excuses. If this is about saving your job, you're wasting your time." Patrick's throat tightened. "No, sir, that's not it at all. I genuinely want to apologize and make things right." Another pause. Patrick held his breath, waiting. "Fine," Brandon said at last. "We can meet. But I want you to understand something, Officer Wallace. I'm not here to make you feel better about what you did. I'm not here to absolve you of your guilt. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir, I understand completely," Patrick replied, relief and anxiety mixing in his chest. They agreed to meet at a local coffee shop in an hour. As Patrick hung up the phone, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At the coffee shop, Patrick arrived early, nervously fidgeting with his cup as he waited. When Brandon walked in, heads turned. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that commanded respect. Brandon sat down across from Patrick, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "All right, Officer Wallace. You wanted to talk, so talk." Patrick swallowed hard, meeting Brandon's gaze. "Mr. Morgan, I want to apologize for my actions that day. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I caused you harm because of it." Brandon's expression remained unchanged. "And you think an apology fixes that? You think it erases the humiliation, the anger, the fear?" "No, sir," Patrick replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it doesn't, but it's a start. I'm here because I want to do better, to be better. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make things right." Brandon leaned back in his chair, studying Patrick's face. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Officer Wallace? How do you plan to undo years of ingrained prejudice?" Officer Patrick sat across from Brandon in a small, quiet diner. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air, but neither man touched the menus in front of them. Patrick's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them on the table. "Mr. Morgan," Patrick began, his voice low and filled with regret. "I want to apologize from the bottom of my heart for what happened that day. I was wrong, plain and simple. I acted on biases I didn't even realize I had, and I caused you harm because of it." Brandon's face remained impassive as he listened, his dark eyes fixed on Patrick's face. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen. Patrick took a deep breath and continued, "I had no right to arrest you without cause. My assumptions were unfounded and racist. I'm deeply ashamed of my actions, and I understand the pain and humiliation I put you through." As Patrick spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back, determined to face Brandon with honesty. Brandon leaned back in his seat, his expression still unreadable. After a moment he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Wallace, I appreciate that you've taken the time to apologize in person. But you need to understand something. Words alone won't fix what happened." Patrick nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, sir. I don't expect them to." Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly. "What I want to know is this. Is your desire to change genuine, or is this just an attempt to get back to work and salvage your career?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Patrick felt a surge of defensiveness, but he pushed it down. He knew he had to be honest, not just with Brandon, but with himself. "Mr. Morgan," Patrick said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I won't lie to you. At first, when all this happened, I was worried about my job. But sitting here now, looking you in the eye, I can honestly say that's not why I'm here." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This experience has forced me to confront some ugly truths about myself. I've realized that I've been part of a system that hurts people, and I can't go back to that. Whether I keep my job or not, I need to change. I need to do better." Brandon studied Officer Patrick's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. The older man's eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound, the soft clink of dishes from the diner's kitchen. "Please, Mr. Morgan," Patrick finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging for a second chance. I want to learn from this terrible mistake. I need to understand the harm I've caused, not just to you, but to others I may have misjudged over the years." Brandon's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. "Officer Wallace, how can I be sure this isn't just about saving your career? It's easy to say the right things when your job is on the line." Patrick leaned forward, his eyes locked on Brandon's. "I understand your doubts, sir. I do. But I swear to you, this goes beyond my job now. This experience has shaken me to my core. I can't go back to being the man I was before. I need to change for myself and for my community." As Patrick spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. Brandon found himself surprised by the raw honesty he heard. There was something in Patrick's sincerity that gave him pause. After a long moment, Brandon sighed. "Officer Wallace, I want to believe you. I really do. But you have to understand that trust is earned, especially after what happened." Patrick nodded eagerly. "I understand completely, Mr. Morgan. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove myself." Brandon considered this, drumming his fingers on the table. Finally, he spoke. "All right, Officer Wallace, I'm willing to give you a second chance." Patrick's face lit up with relief, but Brandon held up a hand to stop him. "But," Brandon continued firmly, "there are conditions, strict ones. You need to prove your willingness to change through actions, not just words. This isn't going to be easy. And if at any point I feel you're not genuinely committed to this process, we're done. Do you understand?" Patrick nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, I understand completely. Thank you for this opportunity. I promise I won't let you down." Brandon leaned back in his seat, his expression still guarded but with a glimmer of hope. "We'll see, Officer Wallace. We'll see." Brandon leaned forward, his fingers interlaced on the table. "I have a suggestion, Officer Wallace," he said, his voice steady and measured. "There's a community outreach program that works to bridge the gap between law enforcement and minority communities. I think you should volunteer there." Patrick's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and apprehension crossing his face. "Volunteer? I'm not sure I understand." "This program," Brandon continued, puts officers in direct contact with people who have been affected by racial profiling and other forms of police misconduct. It's not easy work, but it's important. Patrick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The idea of facing people he might have wronged in the past made his stomach churn. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Brandon's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. Officer Wallace, this may be your only shot at true redemption. And let me be clear, this isn't about getting your job back. This is about confronting your own biases and growing as a person. Patrick's eyes widened as the reality of Brandon's words sank in. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. You're right, he said after a moment. It won't be easy, but I need to do this. Not just for my career, but for myself. Brandon nodded approvingly. Good. I'm glad you see it that way. Because let me tell you, Officer Wallace, the people you'll meet through this program, they've been hurt. They've been scared. They've lost trust in the very system that's supposed to protect them. Patrick winced at Brandon's words, feeling the weight of his past actions even more heavily. I understand, he said softly. And I want to make it right. I want to learn and change. That's a start, Brandon said. But remember, this journey won't be easy. You'll hear stories that will make you uncomfortable. You'll face anger and distrust. Are you prepared for that? Patrick took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I am, he said, his voice growing stronger. I need to face this head on. It's the only way I can truly understand and change. Brandon studied Patrick's face, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. All right, Officer Wallace, I'll make the arrangements. But remember, I'll be watching your progress closely. This is your chance to prove that your words today weren't empty promises. Patrick nodded solemnly, feeling a mix of fear and determination. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. This was his chance to make things right, to become the officer and the man he always thought he was. Officer Patrick stood nervously at the entrance of the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. The colorful posters on the walls promoting unity and understanding seemed to mock him. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room fell silent as he entered. Dozens of eyes turned to him, filled with a mix of surprise, anger, and suspicion. Patrick felt his face grow hot under their scrutiny. A young woman approached him, her arms crossed. "You're the officer from the news, aren't you?" she asked, her voice tinged with distrust. Patrick nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I am. I'm here to volunteer and to learn." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Well, you've got a lot to learn, officer. Follow me." As Patrick trailed behind her, he could hear whispers and murmurs from the others. Some were curious, others angry. He caught snippets of conversation. "Can't believe they let him come here, and what's he trying to prove?" The first few hours were painfully awkward. Patrick was assigned to help sort donations, working alongside community members who kept their distance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of clothing and the occasional cough. During a break, an older man approached Patrick. His eyes were weary but kind. "Officer," he said softly, "I want to share something with you." Patrick nodded, bracing himself for what was to come. The man began to recount a story of his grandson, wrongfully arrested and brutalized by police. As he spoke, his voice trembled with emotion. Patrick listened, his heart growing heavier with each word. I'm so sorry," Patrick whispered when the man finished. "I had no idea." The man patted Patrick's shoulder. "That's why you're here, isn't it? To understand?" More stories followed. A mother spoke of her fear every time her son left the house. A teenager described being followed in stores, always under suspicion. Each tale was a punch to Patrick's gut, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions and the system he represented. As the days passed, Patrick found himself truly listening for the first time in years. He began to see the world through their eyes, understanding the deep-rooted fear and distrust that his uniform represented. One afternoon, as Patrick helped paint a mural promoting community unity, a young boy approached him. "Officer," the boy said hesitantly, "why did you arrest that man on the motorcycle?" Patrick put down his paintbrush, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "I made a mistake," he said softly. "I judged him without knowing him, and that was wrong." The boy nodded solemnly. "My dad says we should always try to understand people before we judge them." "Your dad is a wise man," Patrick replied, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'm here to learn that lesson." As he stood up, Patrick noticed a few people nearby had overheard the conversation. Their expressions had softened slightly, a small crack in the wall of distrust. Patrick picked up his paintbrush again, a newfound determination in his heart. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. As the days turned into weeks, Patrick found himself grappling with the emotional weight of the stories he heard at the community center. Each tale of injustice and fear struck him like a physical blow, leaving him feeling drained and overwhelmed. One evening, after a particularly difficult session where a young man recounted his traumatic experience with police brutality, Patrick sat alone in his car, tears streaming down his face. The guilt was almost unbearable. He realized that his biases hadn't just affected Brandon. They had caused real harm to countless innocent people throughout his career. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice choked with emotion. "How many lives have I damaged without even realizing it?" Despite the emotional toll, Patrick continued to show up at the center day after day. He was determined to prove that his desire to change was genuine. Some days were harder than others, but he pushed through, knowing that this was his path to redemption. The community remained skeptical of Patrick's presence. Whispers still followed him as he moved through the center, and many people avoided making eye contact with him. But as the weeks went by, a few individuals began to notice the sincerity in Patrick's efforts. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly volunteer who had initially given Patrick the cold shoulder, watched him carefully as he patiently helped a group of children with their homework. She saw the gentleness in his eyes and the care he took to explain things clearly. "You know," she said to him one day, her voice softer than usual, "I didn't think you'd stick around this long, but you keep showing up." Patrick looked at her, surprised by the lack of hostility in her tone. "I have to," he replied honestly. "I need to do better, to be better." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly, a hint of approval in her eyes. "Well, that's a start." As Patrick continued his volunteer work, he noticed small changes in the way some people interacted with him. A few began to greet him with hesitant smiles instead of wary glances. Others started to include him in conversations, albeit cautiously. One afternoon, as Patrick was helping to organize a community food drive, he overheard two young men talking nearby. "I don't know, man," one said. "That cop's been here every day for weeks. Maybe he's actually trying to change." The other shrugged. "Yeah, but one guy can't fix a broken system." "True," the first replied, "but at least he's trying, you know." Patrick felt a small spark of hope in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance, but it was a start. He knew he had a long way to go, but hearing those words made him even more determined to continue his journey of change and understanding. As the weeks passed, Brandon kept a watchful eye on Officer Patrick's progress from afar. He'd receive updates from the community center and occasionally drive by to observe Patrick's interactions. Despite his initial skepticism, Brandon couldn't help but notice the officer's unwavering commitment. One sunny afternoon, Brandon parked across the street from the center, watching as Patrick helped unload boxes of donated goods. He saw the older man's face, etched with lines of fatigue but also determination. Brandon's brow furrowed as he considered the possibility that Patrick's transformation might be more than just a ploy to save his career. "He's still showing up," Brandon muttered to himself, a mix of surprise and grudging respect in his voice. As days turned into weeks, Brandon found himself increasingly impressed by Patrick's perseverance. He heard stories from community members about how Patrick listened intently to their experiences, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely affected by what he learned. One day, Brandon received a call from Mrs. Johnson, a respected elder at the center. Her words made him pause. "That Officer Wallace," she said, her voice warm. "He's not just going through the motions, you know. I think he's really trying to understand." Brandon felt a small shift in his perception. He realized that if Patrick were only doing this to save his job, he would have given up long ago. The process was clearly taking an emotional toll on the officer, yet he continued to show up day after day. As Brandon mulled over these thoughts, he decided to pay an unannounced visit to the center. When he arrived, he found Patrick engaged in a deep conversation with a group of young men, listening intently as they shared their experiences with law enforcement. Brandon watched from the doorway, unnoticed. He saw the genuine pain in Patrick's eyes as he heard their stories, the way he nodded in understanding instead of becoming defensive. It was then that Brandon truly began to see that Patrick's efforts were sincere. Maybe, Brandon thought to himself, he really is trying to become a better person. As the day of the community town hall approached, Officer Patrick felt a knot of anxiety growing in his stomach. He'd been invited to speak at the event, organized by the outreach program he'd been volunteering with for weeks. This was his chance to show the community that he had truly changed, but the thought of facing so many people he'd wronged filled him with dread. In the days leading up to the event, Patrick spent hours crafting his speech. He pored over every word, determined to convey his sincere regret and newfound understanding. As he practiced in front of his bathroom mirror, his voice shook with emotion. "I was wrong," he rehearsed, his eyes meeting his reflection. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt innocent people. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do better." The night of the town hall arrived. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, filling the rows of folding chairs. Patrick stood at the back, his palms sweaty as he clutched his note cards. Among the crowd, Brandon slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the middle. His face was a mask of neutrality, but his eyes were sharp, watching Patrick's every move. He was still unsure if the officer would rise to the occasion or crumble under the pressure. As Patrick made his way to the podium, a hush fell over the room. He looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. His throat felt dry, and for a moment, he feared he might not be able to speak at all. But then his eyes met Brandon's in the crowd. The CIA agent's gaze was steady, neither encouraging nor condemning. It was a challenge. "Prove yourself," it seemed to say. Taking a deep breath, Patrick began to speak. His voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as he continued. He spoke of his mistake, of the harm he had caused, and of the journey he had been on since that fateful day. "I stand before you not as a perfect man, but as someone who is trying to be better," Patrick said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've listened to your stories. I've heard your pain, and I understand now how my actions have contributed to a system that has hurt so many of you." As Patrick spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The hostility in some faces softened, replaced by cautious consideration. Brandon leaned forward in his seat, his expression thoughtful. Patrick continued sharing what he had learned during his time volunteering. He spoke of the systemic issues in law enforcement and his commitment to being part of the solution. His words were honest, raw, and deeply personal. "I can't change the past," Patrick said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I promise you I will spend every day working to be the kind of officer you deserve, one who protects and serves all members of this community equally." As Patrick finished his speech, a moment of silence hung in the air. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began. It wasn't thunderous, but it was genuine. Some people in the audience nodded, while others wiped away tears. Brandon sat back in his chair, a mix of surprise and respect on his face. He watched as community members approached Patrick, some to shake his hand, others to share their thoughts. The officer listened to each person intently, his posture humble and open. After the town hall concluded, Officer Patrick took a deep breath, feeling both drained and invigorated. He scanned the thinning crowd, his eyes searching for Brandon. When he spotted the CIA agent near the exit, Patrick's heart raced with nervous anticipation. Gathering his courage, Patrick made his way through the room. As he approached, Brandon turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Brandon," Patrick said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to thank you for giving me this chance to change, to learn. I know I didn't deserve it after what I did, but you've given me an opportunity I'll never take for granted." Brandon studied Patrick's face for a moment, his eyes searching for any hint of insincerity, but all he saw was genuine gratitude and humility. "Officer Wallace," Brandon began, his tone measured but not unkind. "I have to admit, I was skeptical when you first reached out. I thought this might just be an attempt to save your job or your reputation." Patrick nodded, understanding Brandon's initial doubts. "I don't blame you for thinking that. To be honest, at first, that was part of it. But this experience, it's changed me in ways I never expected." Brandon's expression softened slightly. "I can see that," he said. "Your speech tonight, the way you've been working with the community, it's clear you're putting in the effort to understand and grow." Patrick felt a wave of relief wash over him. "It means a lot to hear you say that," he said. "I know I still have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing the work." Brandon nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "There's still work to be done, that's true. But I respect the fact that you've owned your mistakes and are actively trying to make amends. That's not an easy thing to do." Patrick felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Brandon. Your words mean more than you know." Brandon extended his hand. "Keep at it, Officer Wallace. This community needs more officers willing to listen and learn." Patrick grasped Brandon's hand, shaking it firmly. The handshake felt like more than just a polite gesture. It was a symbol of their growing mutual respect, a bridge being built between two men who had started as adversaries. As they parted ways, Patrick felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but he was ready to face the challenges ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Officer Patrick Wallace found himself eagerly anticipating his shifts at the community outreach program. What had once felt like a burden now filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. One sunny afternoon, Patrick arrived at the community center, his arms full of donated books for the after-school reading program. As he struggled to open the door, a familiar face appeared. "Need a hand there, Officer Wallace?" It was Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who had initially been one of his harshest critics. Patrick smiled gratefully. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Johnson, thank you." As they carried the books inside, Mrs. Johnson chatted about her grandchildren. Patrick listened intently, realizing how much he enjoyed these simple interactions he once would have dismissed. Later that day, Patrick found himself helping a group of teenagers with their homework. Among them was Darius, a bright young man who had been particularly wary of Patrick at first. "Hey, Officer Wallace," Darius called out, his voice hesitant but curious. "Can you help me with this math problem?" Patrick's heart swelled with pride as he made his way over. "Of course, Darius. Let's take a look." As they worked through the problem together, Patrick noticed the tension in Darius's shoulders slowly melt away. It was a small victory, but it meant the world to Patrick. The community's acceptance of Patrick didn't happen overnight. It came in small moments, a nod of acknowledgement here, a tentative smile there. But with each passing day, the walls of mistrust began to crumble. One evening, as Patrick was leaving the center, he overheard two women talking. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but that Officer Wallace isn't so bad," one said. "I know what you mean," the other replied. "He's really trying, isn't he?" Patrick felt a warmth spread through his chest. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was making a real difference. As weeks turned into months, Patrick found himself forming genuine connections with the people he once judged unfairly. He learned their names, their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. Each interaction chipped away at his old biases, replacing them with understanding and empathy. One day, as Patrick helped organize a community cleanup event, he realized something profound. He wasn't just here because he had to be. He was here because he wanted to be. The desire to make amends had transformed into a genuine passion for community service. As the sun rose over the city, Brandon and Officer Patrick sat across from each other in a small conference room at the police department. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a sense of determination between the two men. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Patrick?" Brandon asked, his eyes searching the older man's face. Officer Patrick nodded, his jaw set firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Brandon. It's time for real change." Together, they began outlining their plans for new initiatives within the department. Their goal was to promote equality and implement reforms that would address the systemic issues they'd both witnessed firsthand. As word spread about their partnership, reactions among Officer Patrick's colleagues were mixed. Some were supportive, seeing the need for change. Others, however, were less enthusiastic. Officer Johnson, a longtime friend of Patrick's, approached him in the break room one afternoon. "Pat, what are you doing?" he hissed. "You're making us all look bad." Patrick sighed, feeling the weight of his friend's disapproval. "I'm doing what's right, Tom. We can't keep ignoring these problems." As days passed, the resistance grew. Whispers followed Patrick through the hallways. Some officers refused to make eye contact with him, while others openly challenged his ideas during meetings. Despite the pushback, Officer Patrick remained steadfast. He knew that change wasn't easy, but he was committed to seeing it through. Each dirty look or snide comment only strengthened his resolve. One particularly difficult day, after a heated debate with the union representative, Patrick found himself questioning if it was all worth it. He sat alone in his patrol car, feeling the isolation keenly. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Brandon. "Hang in there. What we're doing matters." Those simple words renewed Patrick's determination. He realized that the respect of his peers wasn't as important as doing what was right. With a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and walked back into the station, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the weeks turned into months, Officer Patrick's dedication to change began to ripple through the police department. His boss, Chief Anderson, couldn't help but notice the shift in atmosphere and attitude among the officers. One morning, Chief Anderson called Patrick into his office. Patrick's heart raced as he entered, unsure of what to expect. "Have a seat, Wallace," Chief Anderson said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Patrick sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The chief's expression was unreadable, and Patrick braced himself for the worst. "I've been watching you closely these past few months," Chief Anderson began, "and I have to say, I'm impressed." Patrick's eyes widened in surprise. "Sir?" The chief leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've really turned things around, Wallace. Not just for yourself, but for the whole department." Patrick felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, sir. I've been trying my best." "I can see that," Chief Anderson nodded. "Your work with Brandon and the community outreach program has been exemplary, and I've noticed how you've been encouraging other officers to get involved too." Patrick smiled, thinking of the handful of officers who had started joining him at community events. "It's been challenging, but rewarding," he admitted. "That's what good policing is all about," Chief Anderson said, "and your efforts are starting to transform this department. Officers are talking more about community engagement and understanding different perspectives. It's a slow process, but it's happening." Patrick felt a surge of pride. He hadn't realized how much of an impact his actions were having on his fellow officers. "I want you to know that your hard work hasn't gone unnoticed," Chief Anderson continued. "In fact, I'd like you to head up a new training program for the department, something that focuses on community relations and addressing unconscious biases." Patrick was stunned. "Me, sir? Are you sure?" Chief Anderson nodded firmly. "You've lived it, Wallace. You've made mistakes, owned up to them, and worked hard to change. That's exactly the kind of experience and perspective we need leading this program." Tears pricked at the corners of Patrick's eyes. He blinked them back, overwhelmed by the chief's words and the opportunity being presented to him. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." As Patrick left the chief's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future of policing in their community. One crisp afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the community center. Officer Patrick Wallace stood at the back of the crowded room. His eyes were fixed on Brandon Morgan, who was addressing a group of eager young faces at the front. "Your voices matter," Brandon said, his words clear and strong. "Change starts with each one of you." Patrick felt a swell of pride in his chest. He remembered the day he'd wrongfully arrested Brandon, how his own biases had nearly destroyed both their lives. Now, here they were, working side by side to make their community better. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds. Some wore t-shirts with slogans promoting equality. Others held signs about police reform. Patrick noticed a few of his fellow officers in the crowd, nodding along to Brandon's words. As Brandon continued his speech, Patrick's mind wandered to the journey that had brought them here. The shame he'd felt, the hard work of facing his own prejudices, the countless hours of community service and difficult conversations. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. "And now," Brandon said, pulling Patrick from his thoughts, "I'd like to invite my friend and partner in this work, Officer Patrick Wallace, to say a few words." Patrick's heart raced as he made his way to the front. As he passed by Brandon, they exchanged a nod of mutual respect. Standing before the crowd, Patrick took a deep breath. "A few months ago I made a terrible mistake," he began, his voice shaky but determined. "I let my biases cloud my judgment and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But through that mistake, I learned the most important lesson of my career." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening intently. "I learned that true justice isn't about making assumptions or acting on fear. It's about understanding, empathy, and working together to build a better community for everyone." As Patrick spoke, he saw nods of agreement ripple through the crowd. He caught sight of Brandon at the side of the stage, a small smile on his face. "We've come a long way," Patrick continued, "but we have so much further to go, and I promise you, I'll be here every step of the way, working to make things right." As Patrick finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. He stepped back, feeling a mix of humility and hope. Brandon joined him on stage, and they stood side by side, a living example of what change and second chances could accomplish. Looking out at the crowd, Patrick realized how far they'd come, and how much work still lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Patrick and Brandon, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.